I have had the pleasure of working with Hillary when she was at the Alameda RCD, and then also when she was at the California Association of RCDs. And so she's going to give us a little bit of an introduction to our topic today, which is pollinators. So thank you, Hillary.
Awesome. Thanks, Lisa. Let's see if I can get Zoom to work. Okay. Well, thanks for having me today. And yeah, so I kind of, as Lisa mentioned, I come from an RCD background. I got to work with the California Association of RCDs, and now I get to work coordinating pollinator conservation at the statewide level with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And so Lisa just asked me to kind of provide a background on what's going on with pollinators, much of which you've hopefully already heard, and then a little bit about some activities that you guys could be doing within the watershed to conserve them. So that's what I'll cover. And so, like I just said, I'll talk about the importance of pollinators. I'll specifically focus on monarchs and bumblebees, and then just a few key actions which are habitat and community science focused. So I feel like, you know, whenever I give these talks, I kind of harp on the importance of pollinators, and hopefully you guys have all already heard this, but they really are the linchpins in our ecosystems. Without them, we wouldn't have resilient ecosystems. We would see a lot of decline. And that's because around 80% of flowering plants actually require pollination by animals, which include, you know, bees, hummingbirds, right? The ones that you've heard of, but also in some cases that can be beetles, syrphid flies. So there's a number of different insects and vertebrates that are important. And then of course, there's also this great statistics that 1 out of every 3 bites of food that you eat requires a pollinator to produce it. So, you know, that really represents a big part of the macronutrients in our diet too, the crops that are pollinated. So this is like blueberries, right? Like things that give us vitamin C. So pollinators are important to both natural and agricultural systems. And for ag, there's a great visual way to bring this home. So this is this experiment that Whole Foods did, where they show you their produce section, right, full of all of the great foods that we eat. But when you remove all those pollinated foods, you really see a depletion. And, you know, there's some weird things like oranges, right? Those actually do require a pollinator, but we've managed to get away from requiring pollinators for some of them, like the seedless varieties. So, you know, not like the perfect picture, but it really, like if you toggle back, right, it's pretty striking what it would look like, a world without pollinators. So they're incredibly important. But unfortunately, a lot of the species are declining globally. And you've probably heard the term insect apocalypse, which is not a great term. And we'll talk about some of the reasons why they're declining. But I just want to bring home that this is happening right here in California. So there's this great study that came out 2 years ago by the Forrester Lab at University of Nevada, Reno. They have pulled a bunch of different data sets to try and help us understand what's going on with both common and rare butterflies. So the first one is the charts of Vanessa Annabella. That's the West Coast lady. It's one that's really abundant in California. And there's 3 charts. There's one orange, blue, and then green. And those are 3 different data sets that they use to kind of validate one another. The green one is from these, orange one is from North American Association butterfly counts. People, the community science folks go out, they'll adopt an area and do a survey. And that's data that goes back 30 years. The blue is from a professor at UC Davis, Art Shapiro, who's done this great transect also for like the past 30 years to look at butterfly abundance. It's from the Sierra to the Bay. And then the most recent data we have, which isn't as like specific because people don't use the same survey methodology, but we get a ton of data, is iNaturalist data. So that's green. And if I apply trend lines to all 3 of those data sets, you can see that they all indicate this year after year decline, right? A linear decline. And what these researchers found is that there's a 1.6% average reduction per year. So every year we're seeing 2% fewer butterflies on the landscape. I was just talking to one of CDFW, our biologist yesterday, who was saying, I just haven't seen, you know, buckeye butterflies that much lately, right? And, you know, I think it's this representative of this phenomenon that we're seeing. And then if we focus in on one species that's in the news a lot, that I'm sure Tora will be talking about, is, the Western monarch's been in the news because it's had these extreme population fluctuations. And so this graph, hopefully you're familiar with it, Xerces Society puts it out. It shows their Thanksgiving count numbers, and those green bars, those are the Thanksgiving count numbers. So how many butterflies we see at overwintering sites each year. And then it's a little deceptive because there's this blue line that is going up, right? Whereas the main trend is going down. But that blue line is the number of sites that people are looking at. So we're looking at more sites, but we're actually seeing fewer butterflies. And if you just hone in, right, we saw this major crash to 30,000 butterflies from around an average of 200,000 a few years ago. That really set off alarm bells. Then in 2020, right, we only saw 2,000. Like, we were wondering, is this species going to go extinct here, or at least, we'll only have the resident population? And then luckily this past winter, we saw this major bounce back up. We don't know why that happened. We'd love to know a little bit more about that. And I'll talk about a community science project you can get involved in a little bit later in this talk to help us try and answer some of these questions. But hopefully it gives us the opportunity to springboard and build on that. It's not a recovery, but that bounce back to try and help the population further. But, emblematic of butterfly species experiencing extreme population fluctuations. If we switch now to think about bees, that we're also seeing declines, but we don't have as great of data. Luckily, we do have good data for our most charismatic bee species, which are the Bumble Bees. They're long-lived generalists, right? You see them kind of all season. So they are really critical to ecosystem function because they'll visit a whole bunch of different flowers. So models show if you pull them out of a system, then you kind of see the unraveling of that ecosystem. And unfortunately, this is from the IUCN, and what we're seeing is that 25% of these species are at risk of extinction. That's a huge proportion of these really important pollinators. And here in California, we have 26 species of bumblebee. So based on that math, right, we would think that there are 6 at-risk bumblebee species in the state. Unfortunately, there's 8 that we're pretty concerned about, so a little bit over 25%. And the bolded ones, I don't know if the bold really shows up. I'm sorry about that. But those are the ones that are listed as species of greatest conservation need in the California State Wildlife Action Plan, which is basically our guiding document for species recovery. And so those are the Bombus franklini, Franklin's bumblebee, Bombus sucklei, the cuckoo, Suckley's cuckoo bumblebee, Bombus crachii, Caliginosus, which is the obscure bumblebee, Morrisoni, Morrison's bumblebee, and Bombus occidentalis. And then there's a few other species that have been petitioned for federal listing. And the Franklin's bumblebee was actually listed. It's the first listed bumblebee that occurs in California, or did occur. We haven't seen it since 2006, but we're hopeful that people will re-find it because typically species that we think are extinct are found again, luckily within somewhere between 3 and 60 years. So, we've still got like 50 more years to try and find this species before we're super worried. Okay, so now that you've heard about the declines, what is driving them? Well, it's the usual culprits, right? Climate change, habitat loss, pesticide exposure, disease, and then interactions between these factors. And it's just so challenging to find a single smoking gun responsible for insect declines that entomologists have just started using the phrase death by 1,000 cuts. There's just so many of these interrelated factors that it's hard to kind of pull out one and say, if we solve this, we can solve this issue. So we need a much more holistic, comprehensive approach to try and prevent insect decline. And at California, at the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, we really are tasked with conserving California's biodiversity. And California, as you know, is the host to some of the highest number of species in the state. We're a biodiversity hotspot. And that's true for pollinators. This is a map from NatureServe, which kind of pulls data from state agencies. And it's highlighting in yellow the areas with the highest pollinator richness. And you can see that the Bay Area, where you are right now, is one of the highest areas of richness in the entire state. And overall, we think we have about 1,600 species of native bees. We don't have great estimates for all of the other pollinators, unfortunately. Okay, so given that picture, what can you do to protect pollinators in your area? And the answers, luckily, is it's pretty simple. You can create habitat with pollinators in a lot of cases. If you build it, they will come. But you can also become a community scientist and contribute data that helps agencies like ours or nonprofits that we partner with better understand pollinator populations. So if we get back to monarchs, I said that we don't really know what caused that decline, right? But researchers think that they've started to isolate when the population declined at first. And we think it was right after that overwintering period when they leave the coastal areas for that first generation. And remember, monarchs are they have multiple generations in a year, typically about 3 to 5, and then they have that overwintering super generation. And they exponentially increase over time. And so if you have an issue with one generation, that has ripple effects on all those subsequent generations, right? So if the first generation doesn't do well, then we would expect the other generations not to do well. And so what we think is happening is that monarchs are leaving the overwintering sites earlier because of climate change and warmer temperatures, and they're not finding their host plant, milkweed, out on the landscape. So we think that there's a bit of a mismatch between when they are getting the cues and when the milkweeds are coming up. So researchers postulated that we might be able to fill this gap by looking at the teal area in this map and trying to increase early blooming milkweed species. And so this map is a tool that we created with a bunch of different partners to help us focus our different efforts for monarchs. And so again, you guys fall into that teal area where this would be a great activity for you to conduct. So first, what are early season milkweed species? Okay, so I have maps up here of 2 of our most common milkweed species, Fascicularis, narrowleaf milkweed, and Spiciosa, showy milkweed. They both occur in Contra Costa County. They're pretty readily available. However, you can look at their bloom period, which I just pulled the graphs from CalFlora, and they bloom in well, I'm seeing them now actually, May, but their main bloom period is June and July, which means that they don't start coming out until late March, early April. So they're not really there for that period when monarchs are leaving overwintering sites early, which can be as early as mid-January. So there's a few species, however, that do seem like they are coming up a little earlier. And I just want to focus on that first row of this table, Asclepias californica. So we've documented with partners throughout the state that it is coming up as early as January, so starting to create leaves. And monarchs don't need it to be in bloom, right? They just need the leaves to lay their eggs for the caterpillars to eat. And on Mount Diablo, just I think mid-March, I went out and actually saw a monarch ovipositing on this milkweed species. So we are seeing them use it, and those eggs turned into caterpillars. I had a colleague go out a few weeks later. So we feel like, this approach might be a good one. And Mount Diablo is the center of the California milkweed range in Northern California. So let me pull it up. So this is California milkweed. You can see it's kind of got this interesting distribution where it's kind of the coast range, and then it kind of swings up around the Sierra foothills and down into Southern California. There are a few errant dots in the north, but those are misidentifications, so ignore those. It's not California milkweed. But Contra Costa has a bunch of points, right? Like we used to see it in Morgan Territory. People have been out. We haven't seen it. It's in Diablo Foothills Regional Park, Black Diamond Mines. And like I said, Mount Diablo has a really great population. So we've been working with a plant materials work group, which is comprised of folks all throughout the state, to try and collect the seeds from this and then make it more commercially available, because it's just not one that you can find. It's really hard to propagate. But we've managed to collect a bunch of seed, and now there's nurseries that carry it. For example, the Watershed nursery in Richmond has some sources from Alameda and Contra Costa counties, and is a place where you can get this. This species loves steep slopes, dry environments. You know, it's very drought tolerant, we think. So a cool species to consider planting or including in your projects if you have that kind of habitat, like grasslands, kind of dappled oak woodland. And it's also gorgeous. And I definitely think if we can figure out how to grow it, one that people would be interested in planting in their gardens as well. So I want to switch gears. I also mentioned that we don't really know what's going on with monarchs. And so one thing that we're working on with a professor from Colorado State University, Dr. Chris Funk, is salvaging monarchs to look at their full genome so that we can understand where the monarch's coming from. So when we saw that big influx this past year, we didn't know, you know, did the Eastern population rescue the Western population? There's just a lot of questions. And so we created this short-term community science project. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of funding to help people get the materials or ship things to Dr. Funk, but I'm located here in the Bay Area. So, you know, maybe there's a way to get me your dead monarchs directly. But basically what you would do is you'd take a really brief training that talks about why we're doing the project and the permit that CDFW has given to Chris Funk and what those requirements are. You take a quiz and get added to that permit. And then if you see a dead monarch, you collect it and then pop it in your freezer until you can get it to me or Dr. Funk directly. So I can put this link into the chat when I'm done. But if you guys are interested, this is a great way for if you just happen to see a dead monarch to contribute its data. And we're hoping to work with another professor, Dr. Louis Yang at UC Davis, and then take the rest of the monarch that doesn't get processed for this and do an isotopic analysis. So that kind of will further tell us more than just the genes, like where the monarchs originated. So I think it's really cool, and that might help us a little bit understand what's going on and where we can focus our conservation efforts. And then again, I mentioned bumblebees, but we don't have great data, unfortunately, on how bumblebees are doing. We have a lot of historic data. We have some iNaturalist data, but we don't have a comprehensive, you know, study where we can look at the same survey effort people are doing all throughout the state and then be able to say, okay, we know how this species is doing right now. And so we partnered with the Xerces Society and the Bureau of Land Management to create this thing called the California Bumblebee Atlas. And what it is we gridded out the state and all of these different grid cells, and we're asking community science volunteers to adopt a grid cell and go out and do 2 surveys. They're 45-minute surveys. You go out with a net, you net bees off flowers, you put them on ice, you take pictures of them, and then you upload those pictures to Bumblebee Watch, and then a taxonomist can ID them. So you don't need to, and it's really fun. I was out there with some CDFW biologists yesterday. They were really excited about it. And so if you are interested in helping us better understand bumblebee populations, you also take pictures of the plants they're using, so it helps us understand plant preferences so we can design restoration projects in the future. This is a great opportunity to get involved, and you can just sign up at California Bumblebee Atlas. It's kind of a similar process. You take trainings and longer, it's about like 4 hours of training, and then you can get signed on to the permit and then be able to go out. And I should mention that I'm working with the Pollinator posse on offering a local field training for the survey methodology, just in case you've never netted a bee and want some experience doing that, or want me to look at your close-up photos and see if you're using the right settings. So we're hoping to hold that at Lake Merritt Botanic Garden either on June 4th or June 18th. We're just waiting to hear about the final date. Okay, there's a bunch of other community science projects out there. There's the Western Monarch Mystery Challenge that is run from February 14th through April 20th every year out of the, Washington State University. They're basically trying to figure out where monarchs are going during that first generation, because again, it's really critical and we don't have enough information. If you happen to be out there and see milkweed on the landscape, especially one of those early milkweed species, you can put it on the Western monarch milkweed mapper. I know if you're on private lands, then that's a bit of a challenge, but if it's a public land, you can pop it on there, or on iNaturalist, they pull data from there, and that helps us understand where milkweed are in the state and where we need to fill in gaps. There's also Monarch joint venture has the integrated monarch monitoring protocol, which basically has, they've basically put these cells in different parts of this country and are asking people to go find them and then adopt a cell and use their protocol to see if milkweed does or does not occur there. And there is one, I believe, in Morgan Territory. So there is one locally that has not been adopted. There's the Monarch Larval Monitoring Project, which maybe Tora will talk about, where you go out and see how monarchs are doing over time. But you can't captively rear them in California without a permit, and the project has declined to get a permit. So you can't do the final stage where you would bring them inside and look at parasites. Just wanted to point that out. If you happen to want to see a bumblebee, snap a picture of it, and don't want to do the full methodology, you can submit that to Bumblebee Watch. Still, we don't get the survey effort, but it is good data. And then iNaturalist, I mentioned, is a great way to provide data if you're out there in the field. All right, that was a bit of a whirlwind, and I didn't get to go too in depth into anything, but hopefully you get a sense of some actions that you can take to conserve pollinators right in your backyard. So thanks so much. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Hillary. That's fantastic. I always learn something new whenever you speak. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to either raise your hand, put it in the chat, or speak up. I was going to mention that I'm personally really excited about the Bumblebee Atlas and also that genomics project, and would love to at some point, maybe we can do like a joint training or something like that, and we can try to get folks here involved in those projects. John, did you have a question?
Yeah, let's see. Curious to know whether you had a chance to coordinate it all with Office of Planning and California Office of Planning, because this is something that should be showing up in general plans around the state and the city governments. I live in the city of Berkeley, and we're like, there's something that's, we're actually doing that in our community. So I'm wondering if, this is really something that should be a land use issue as well as simply, something among biologists.
So that's a fantastic idea. And I didn't mention this, but we just had our first meeting of something called the Multi-Agency Pollinator Collaborative, where we're bringing state and federal agencies together in California to try and create a shared vision for, what we need to do. And we didn't include the California Office of General Planning, but we can invite them to be part of this. We do have, the California Coastal Commission, which has local management plans that do identify ecologically sensitive habitat areas that need to be conserved, but that's more of a mechanism for if there is an impact to a site. For example, I recently got called about PG&E trimming trees in an overwintering grove near power lines in Bolinas, right? And they didn't have permission to do that, so we went to the Coastal Commission. They're working it out. But I think the more proactive way of trying to include it and conserve things is a great idea. Some things I didn't talk about, which I, in retrospect, could have included in this talk, is there's two great ways to get cities involved. And one is Berkeley has something called Bee City USA. It's a comprehensive program where you can get certified to do all these actions and participate. There's also the Mayor's Monarch Pledge, which I know Tora and Terry have had success having, Oakland adopt, and so they could better speak to, if you wanted your city to get involved in that.
So Office of Planning and Research, it's at the state of California.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
You bet.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I'm glad you brought that up. I'm not sure if folks are aware of like the WAFA, Western Monarch Butterfly Conservation Plan. There are some plans out there that I don't know, Hillary, if you want to say anything about them, but that make it, I think, a little bit easier for cities or agencies to work on this issue?
Yeah, so the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies worked with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and created a 50-year monarch conservation plan, and it has specific actions and goals that we would like to see, happen. For example, in the Central Valley, we have a target of creating 50,000 acres of breeding habitat by 2029. So there's those kind of targets. There's outreach targets. One of the things that our multi-agency pollinator collaborative wants to do is tweak it, because it was created before the decline, and also isn't as California specific as it could be, and doesn't address, for example, the resident monarch population. And so we're wanting to create new objectives that could then be adopted.
Well, that's great. Thank you for that update. I'm glad that you guys are looking at that some more. Did anyone else have any questions that they wanted to raise or comments? Derek.
Yeah, Hillary, thanks for your presentation. I thought it was really thorough, and I really appreciate your bringing it back to that holistic picture again. That whole death by 1,000 cuts seemed like a really effective visual. Is there any available like outreach materials or kind of like tabling materials that you would point us to?
Sounds like the Pollinator posse might have something, but that's from a great article from Wagner et al. From a special issue from the from PNAS on insect decline, and so it's easy to grab. But yeah, I get asked a lot about creating pamphlets, and I'll probably try to create one at some point this year on the need for a scientific collecting permit for monarchs, because I think I answer that question more than any other question, like at least twice a week somebody asks. And I did create an FAQ on that topic, but it's, I guess, too in-depth and very sciencey. As a public agency, I wanted to have that backing. But yeah, I think having more little tidbits would be helpful. That's a great idea. If you guys create something, please share it with me. Put it out there.
Yeah, and we do have, thank you for that. We do have a lot of great resources from Xerces and Monarch Joint Venture and others on our Monarch Conservation Program page on our ccrcd.org. I also got to work with Hillary on creating our milkweed guide for Contra Costa. She had created one for Alameda, and so then we worked on one for Contra Costa. So if you're interested in that, learning more about what you could plant in your garden or for your projects, please check that out. Did anyone else have any questions? Okay, Igor, please.
Oh, I think you're muted.
You're muted.
It's like the perpetual issue with Zoom.
There, finally it unmutes. I muted myself because the phone was ringing here. I appreciate the second opportunity here. I did mean to ask earlier about pesticides. That seems to be one factor that we can actually directly control. A lot of these other things are a little more indirect, and maybe we're still at the learning stage, but with pesticides, we know what harm they do, and we know how to apply them and how not to apply them. I was wondering if you had a sense for how things stand and how things are progressing, whether we're making progress there, or is it staying static, or is it getting worse, or whatever?
Well, so the California Department of Pesticide Regulation is what regulates pesticides, and they just proposed new standards in terms of what neonics, when they can and can't be applied. I have to admit that I have been so busy, I have not read them, so I cannot provide you the update, but I do think it's good that they have taken additional actions on some of them and re-reviewed the data. So, that could have an impact. Xerces is about to publish, they did a pretty comprehensive study a few years ago looking at levels of different pesticides and herbicides in milkweed from nurseries, from agricultural areas, from, urban areas. And they found on average 9 chemicals per sample. So pretty high levels. They followed that up where they just collected samples from nurseries. And I haven't heard a talk, but I've heard through the grapevine a lot of nurseries, even ones that say these are pesticide free, have neonics and other pesticides in them. And so that's a major issue in an area that needs to be addressed. I mentioned that plant materials work group that I co-facilitate, and we're meeting today at 1, but we meet quarterly and talk about all these things. And so we've actually invited Xerces to come talk to us about their recent findings at our next meeting. So if anybody's interested in that, you can email me or ask Lisa how to get in touch, and I can add you to that list. Xerces also has some great pesticide BMPs, so how to protect habitat from pesticides. So we're trying to promote those, and we work, a lot of the participants in our work group actually are native plant nurseries like Great Valley Seed, Watershed Nursery, Heritage Growers, Hedgerow Farms has come before. So we're trying to work with those nurseries that do use really good practices already and promote them.
Do you have a sense for how things are going? Are we on an upward or a downward or level trajectory?
For monarchs?
In general, for pesticide use and
For pesticide use.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like when you get data, a lot of it is continuing to increase. I will be speaking at there's a bunch of grower groups created a group called the California Pollinator Coalition. And I think they're trying to identify best management practices that they can implement to try and reduce pesticide use and also increase habitat in ag. So hopefully they can come up with some good solutions that can minimize exposure to pollinators. But yeah, I keep proposing some studies to do pesticide research. Where we're really interested. We have a lot of habitat areas of reserves in the Central Valley, and we don't know what the drift looks like into those areas, but apparently it's like a politically volatile topic and nobody wants to give us funding to look at that yet. Maybe someday.
Well, keep
Yeah,
on talking in the
oh, sorry, go
meantime.
ahead, Igor, please.
I'm sorry, I was just gonna say I appreciate your efforts and hang in there and let us know how things are going from time to time.
Will do. Thanks.
I was just going to mention really quick that one of our assembly members has recently introduced legislation that would help limit the use of neonicotinoids, which are one of the main pesticides that do a lot of harm to pollinators. And I'm going to put a thing in the chat for folks if you want to read more about that. So thank you so much, Hillary, and feel free to stay, but I also know that you have lots of demands on your time. So if you have to drop off, we understand. Thank you so much. Before we move on.
Hillary.
Oh yeah, please.
Hillary, are you still there? Yeah, so the date for the Bumblebee training is the 4th, June 4th. Before you disappeared, I wanted to tell you that's the date.
Awesome. Okay. Great. So yes, if you guys are interested, we'll try and put together a flyer or something else so that folks can join. And it'll mostly just be, like I said, how to net the bees if you're worried about doing the protocol. Thanks, Tora.
Yeah, that would be great if you could share that info with us so that I can then share it out as well. So before we move on, I just wanted to, we had a couple of additional people join us after or during Hillary's talk. And so I wanted to give them an opportunity to introduce themselves and potentially give any news or updates that they might have. Let's see. Stephen, did you want to introduce yourself, or are you just joining to?
Just joining to listen.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. And then Fareed.
Yeah, can you guys hear me okay? Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I appreciate that. Sorry for joining late. I've joined a few of these meetings in the past and just recently started a Friends of the Concord Creeks group. And I posted something to Nextdoor almost a week ago and was surprised that a ton of people responded. And so decided to make an actual group on Nextdoor and working with, this is very new to me, so I'm not sure where this is going to go, but I'm meeting with Lisa and Chris tomorrow to discuss funding and maybe some other things. And I've been working with Bob at the Walnut Creek Watershed Council and Leslie at Friends of the Creeks for Walnut Creek. And yeah, there are a few people that sound promising, like they would actually be interested in helping from an administrative level. So that would definitely offload some of the work. So I'm excited to reach out to them and find out what they can do and how we can work together. And let's see, the last thing I wanted to mention is that I just reached out to the Concord City Manager and just waiting to hear back from her. So that's where I'm at. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Fareed. I'm really excited about this. We've been hoping that we could get some folks to, get together and form Friends of the Concord Creeks. And I also am a Concord resident, so I'm particularly excited about this. So looking forward to meeting with you tomorrow.